Hey everyone, Reid Henrichs with Valor. I really hate what the U.S. is becoming. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start this video out with a caveat. I don't hate the United States. I don't hate the Constitution. I hate what is happening in this country and what it is rapidly becoming. I've got a few points to cover in this one, but the first one I'm going to lead off with is hopefully something that you see for yourself. That this nation is becoming a nation of scared sheep. Sheep eat grass with their head down, facing the ground, oblivious to any danger that goes around them. They do exactly what they're told to do, and they do what the other sheep are doing. So when you hear people saying the same thing over and over and over and over again, and then it's an echo chamber, that's a great sign that it's a sheep. It's a herd of sheep. Since when was the aim in this country security rather than personal liberty and freedom? And to a large degree, we have a vast swath of the adult and younger generation valuing safety and security over natural and property rights. This is probably the worst part of it, and I don't really care what the government's going to do. I mean, they're gonna do all the statist BS. They're going to constantly try to do that. That's all governments have ever done throughout history, is pass stupid fiat laws and idiotic ordinances that are largely unpopular. But what the most disappointing thing to me is that it seems like a large percentage of people in this country are actually clamoring for that. They're okay with that. One of the hallmarks of a totalitarian society in, say, Soviet Russia or East Germany or any other country where socialism and communism have taken root is that they had a large percentage of the population that was informers. And on top of those informers, people willing to tattle like the little idiot children that they are, and that's what they've probably always been. They just never got beat up enough in school to breed that behavior out of them. But don't worry, that time is coming. But in early days in their life, they just didn't get their butts whooped. Usually when I was growing up, if somebody was a little tattle girl, a little tattletale, they got dealt with. They got beat down. Well, I don't know if that's happening nowadays. It clearly isn't, because they survive into adulthood and continue that same behavior. And in that same vein, what you've got dopey, idiotic government officials that uphold that. You've got the rule follower, rule enforcers, either that's at the police or the federal level or some little government peon that's got a little piece of tin on their little chest, and then they want to try to enforce this. Well, I've got a question for people that are willing to do that. You police out there, or you FBI agents, or you Secret Service people, or anybody else that earns a paycheck off the American taxpayer. I've got another question for you. How are you any different? How are you any different than an official in, say, Germany in the 1930s? How are you any different than the Stasi of East Germany? How are you any different than the KGB or the NKVD? How are you any different because you use the same excuse? Oh, I need a job, and it's for the greater good. Well, A, you can find a different job, and B, it's not for the greater good. The greater good is individual liberty. The greater good is natural rights. The greater good is limited government. The greater good is laws that protect people from government, not government from the people. That's what the greater good is. And if you don't believe that, and if you don't recognize that, understand you're not a public servant at all. If you believe that, you're a government servant. And I think that you need to understand that. And the problem is that you value your paycheck and your pension over other people's rights. And that's wrong, and you need to recalibrate and reevaluate your life if they're one of those people. The other reason why I hate what the United States is becoming is because when I look at Washington D.C., which is, by the way, the least American city of all, Washington D.C. resembles an American city about as good as the Red Star of China does. And they're totally like all about each other, because it's all about complete, centralized, unfettered power. And as I look at Washington, D.C. and look at images of that district, when I look at it, I see a barbed wire, concertina-wrapped, chain-link fence, little enclosed fortress that they have erected around themselves. Now, their excuse is, we have to be aware of all the threats. We have to be aware of all the threats in this country, so we're going to erect a little fortress that... Wait a minute, I thought walls didn't work. Walls didn't work. So we can't build a wall at the border, but they can build a wall around themselves because they use it under the guise of, we are afraid of crazy extremists that are going to come in there. Let me tell you something. On January 6th, if people wanted to mess your ass up, they would have done it. And instead, all you had was a couple of yahoos dressed up in costumes with perfectly positioned cameras, by the way. I don't know if you remember that or not, but the photographers were in perfect position to take these pictures of all of those people that were involved with that. But make no mistake about it, if the American people wanted to hurt you, we would have hurt you. We would have hurt you by now. And I think that you need to understand that you're not as important as you think you are. And I'm speaking directly to people in Congress. You're not as important as you think you are. And you're not as invincible as you think you are either. And if you really thought you were invincible, you wouldn't be building that fortress. You would not have deployed more United States troops in Washington, D.C. that are in Iraq and Afghanistan put together. If you really thought you were invincible, you would not have deployed all of those troops there. And by the way, did you know there's more troops in Washington, D.C. right now than there were in the surge in Iraq? Did you know that in 2007, 2008? Did you know there's more troops in Washington, D.C. than they put in the surge in Iraq? What does that tell you about their mentality? Now, what you're looking at there is you are looking at the most worthless, incompetent, inept government that has ever pervaded the sacred soil of the United States. You are looking at a group of people who is so unfit to govern that if you would have done this 20 years ago, if you would have showed what was going to happen, this would never have been allowed to happen 20 years ago. This would not have happened. And now you've got a sham impeachment for the second time on a guy that they're absolutely terrified of, Donald Trump. And I'll be the first to tell you, I've been critical of Donald Trump, especially when it comes to the Second Amendment. I liked a lot of the other stuff he did, but I did not like the stuff that he was talking about doing with the Second Amendment. So I've been very critical of him. That said, these idiots that are seeking to impeach him after he's out of office, this is nothing but a sham. So you can see that they were coming after him for at least 5 years on this when he announced his candidacy, and then all through the 4 years of his presidency it's happening. What does he represent? He represents not being one of them. He represents being a person who doesn't bow down and kiss the ring on their stupid little hands. So they have to destroy him. Well, the problem is that they can try to do this all they want to, but all it does is aggravate and irritate other people who did vote him, all 75 million people that did vote for him. Another reason why I hate what the United States is becoming is because of freedom of the press, or lack thereof. It used to be that the press was somewhat balanced, somewhat critical of both sides of the aisle. But what you've got now is a major news outlets like CBS, NBC, ABC, and even Fox now. What you've got them is being mouthpieces for the radical left. What you've got is them being mouthpieces for the Democrats. And what you've got is they have zero holding anyone's feet to the fire, provided they're a leftist. Now, they will not do that to their own because they are leftist hacks. They are propagandists. This is what happens in a socialist communist country, is that you've got the news that is in cahoots with the ruling party. And that's exactly what has happened here. And if you don't believe me on this, what you've got also is on alternative news or on social media, they're trying to silence and quelch any kind of opposition to their official narrative. And my thing is, if we have free speech, if we have a First Amendment in this country, why wouldn't you let those ideas come to the surface? Why wouldn't you debate those ideas on an open forum? Why wouldn't you have all viewpoints being listened to and see who has the most persuasive option? Now you're saying, well, Reid, you're posting on YouTube. That's true. But you know what? I know a lot of people who have been censored on YouTube. I know a lot of people who have had content taken down. I know a lot of people who have had their algorithms suppress their content, especially relative to the size of their channel. So what they're doing here is they're trying to prevent this kind of message from getting out. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's not just limited to there. I mean, you're talking about Facebook doing it. Twitter, what a joke. That nose ring little beta cuck CEO that they've got out there, he has zero values whatsoever other than outright fascism and totalitarianism. So what's the solution to all this? Well, I'm going to tell you guys the same thing I've been telling you for years. That's number one, organize into small groups. I'm talking 3, 4, 5 people in your local area. You know, that's where you're going to have the biggest influence. People will have the greatest influence in their local areas. Get your friends together, get proficient. And here's the big deal. The real thing is that an armed population can never be subjugated nor controlled. That is why arms control is such a high priority throughout history in totalitarian countries. And make no mistake about it, the left is seething that we have firearms. They are looking at any excuse to try to pass legislation. The problem is, even if they do pass legislation that does it, it violates our natural rights, violates the Second Amendment. It violates every tenet of a person who gives consent to govern. And so my thing is if they want to start passing gun control laws, they want to start outlawing all our regular firearms, they no longer have consent to govern, and they certainly would not be in charge of us. They certainly wouldn't be in charge out where I live. They certainly wouldn't be in charge of places where many of you watching this video will live. Even if you live in a place that is a little bit more draconian, even if you live in that place, hey, freedom's not easy. It's not easy to earn, and it's certainly not easy to keep. And so you're going to have to ask yourself some hard questions. What are you going to do when that finally gets to that point of the curve where you've had enough, where it finally gets to that point in the curve where, well, I really don't consent to them governing me anymore? You're going to have to ask yourself those hard questions. What did our ancestors do? Well, read history that's real, and what our founders actually stood for and what they advocated for was free individuals. Free individuals who were armed, free individuals that were proficient in the use of firearms, free individuals who are willing and able to stand up to tyranny. And if you don't know what tyranny is, go to Webster's dictionary and look up what that definition is. Tyranny, if paraphrase it, is that government has assumed powers not delegated to it by we the people. And there are plenty of examples of that. So I think we're approaching that time in our country's history where we are getting to that tyrannical point where it's way past the 50% mark of tolerance. So read a history book about what our founding fathers did, what our ancestors did. Read a history book about what happened when they decided that they'd had enough. And before anyone goes out there and says, well, Reid, are you advocating for violence? No, I'm not the one that's willing to send armed people to violate other people's natural rights. That would be local, state, and the federal government potentially. And so we're not the ones that are advocating violence. What we are doing is giving consent to a government to govern us, provided that they protect our natural rights. It's our right to life and the right to defend it with firearms, right to liberty, which means the right to live our life according to what we see fit, provided that we're not hurting anybody else, and the right of pursuit of happiness, which means the right to acquire, improve, and develop property. And so I think that when we give consent to govern, what that means is the government has to uphold that. And if they fail to do that, then they no longer have our consent. And if they no longer have our consent, we don't have a working relationship. In fact, there's no relationship at all. It's a group of people assuming powers over our lives that we did not give them. And we need to start looking at these ideas of natural rights, and we need to start looking at these ideas of free men and women and what it takes to acquire, earn, and maintain that lifestyle. If you found the information in the video helpful, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Facebook, that link is down below. And if you want to learn not only these history lessons, but how to get the skills in order to protect yourself, your family, and your way of life, come on out to Valor Ridge and we can help you with that. This is Reid Henrichs at Valor Ridge reminding you, the lessons that we learn are written on the tombstones of others. We'll see you on the ridge.